And we're back. Max, walk me through Combat Corner for this week.
Yeah, so we've got three things on the Combat Corner radar for this week. A recap of UFC Fight Night Vegas 16, a quick recap and thoughts on Errol Spence Jr. versus Danny Garcia, and a preview of UFC 256 that's coming up next week. So we're going to start off with the UFC Fight Night recap, the fights that caught my eye, i.e. the ones with finishes in the main event. So the first one of that was Ilia Topuria versus Damon Jackson. Topuria was coming in he's known for having a black belt in jiu-jitsu, a very good grappler who would come in against Youssef Zalal, a highly touted featherweight prospect who was on a 3-0 tear, I believe. And Topuria came in on short notice and took him by decision. It was very impressive. So he was going up against a lower caliber opponent in Damon Jackson, who was like a longtime UFC vet who had just returned to the organization. But Jackson was also a wrestler first, which made it interesting. How dominant was Ilia going to be in the grappling? But typically when you have two grapplers go up against each other, they know they can't put themselves in a bad grappling position. If they take a stupid shot for a takedown, then the experienced grappler is going to know exactly what to do and how to end up in an advantageous position. So they'll typically take a dominant position, but they won't do something risky. And it's also an insight into how confident they are about their striking, because often they'll feel like, I'm a 55-45 advantage in the grappling, but I feel like I have a 70-30 advantage in the striking, so they choose to fight there. So that's more or less what we saw both fighters' game plans starting the fight. But Topuria was the younger fighter, the hungrier fighter, the more athletic fighter, and had the better game plan for the striking. He just showed a lot of speed, great footwork. He kept mixing it up to the body. Again and again, he was pressuring in with power shots. This is all over the span of 3 minutes, because at the end of that 3-minute stretch, he pressured Jackson against the fence, landed a nice, he wasn't southpaw, he was orthodox. He just touched him with an uppercut, which made Jackson worry about the head. Beautiful left hook to the body, really hurt Jackson on that one. As soon as he was hurt, right straight, dropped him. One more punch for ground and pound. It was a beautiful finish. Not against a super high level opponent, but when your best asset is your grappling and you come in and show striking like that, it puts you high on it, rises your stock. When you're 23 years old and do that, even more. So can't wait to see what's next for this guy. Next fight, Luis Smolka versus Jose Quiñonez at 135 bantamweight. Both have had high ceilings when they entered the UFC, but have struggled to meet that ceiling. Different backstories there. We won't go into it too in depth, but both needed the win. And Quiñonez came out. I thought he looked like the better fighter. I thought he won the first round. He put a very high level pace of footwork on. It almost looked like he was vibrating, but he was landing nice leg kicks, and he kept looking for knees up the middle in the clinch, and he kept mixed up his grappling well. But Smolka adjusted beautifully in the second round. Quiñonez was getting his takedowns through a body lock. So after 3 or 4 of those, Smolka read a body lock, turned it into a head and arm throw, got on top, and just surprised Quiñonez by having a really strong hip pressure and full mount, stayed on top, and just ground and pounded out a finish real quick. He had a better second round than first round, even preceding that. But that's why I love mixed martial arts. 2 seconds of not being diligent enough can lose you the fight. Quiñonez was getting the better of the grappling exchanges up to that point. I don't think he recognized the grappling threat. And a lot of the times grappling in MMA looks like one fighter sitting in another fighter's guard, landing hammer fists so the ref doesn't stand you up. And that can make you a little lax. I think Quiñonez didn't recognize the threat quick enough, and beautiful job by Smolka to just take a dominant position and search for the finish. This next fight was on your radar, so we got to talk about it. Justin Leavitt versus Matt Wiman, 20-second body slam or slam KO, and it was hard to watch levels of brutal. Now, Leavitt was coming in off a Contender Series win. We're going to talk more about the Contender Series later in the Combat Corner, but he hadn't fought in the UFC yet. Matt Wiman was a longtime UFC vet who had a 5-year layoff from, I believe, 2014 to 2019, and 2 losses in 2019. So not a super high bar for Leavitt to pass. And the betting line reflected that. I think he was a minus 475 favorite or so, around there. But great job by Leavitt to recognize the situation. He went for a takedown, and Wiman just sat in a triangle in the air, or pulling guard in the air, which I've been watching mixed martial arts now for about 4 years, and I'd never seen this turn of events go like this. He just held on to that full guard for 10 seconds, I think. Leavitt walked him across the octagon to his corner. Wiman was still holding on to full guard, and I learned this Saturday night. When you hold on to full guard, it's a mistake because it opens up the slam. So you've got to keep your feet on the ground. After 10 seconds of Wiman doing that, Leavitt had the wherewithal to frame an elbow on his head, drop him for the slam. Nasty KO against a guy who's taken a fair few KOs, let's be honest. But yeah, I mean, it was poor fight IQ by Wiman. The only times I see fighters do pull guard in the air like that is when they're very high level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belts, and the fighter holding them immediately has to worry about their neck or something else. This was only the 12th KO by slam in the UFC, and there's a reason for that. But nice job by Leavitt. He was very articulate, well-spoken, seems like a super thoughtful guy. The fact that it made it onto your radar is even more impressive. So I think it's time for Wiman to retire. He's 0-3 in this stint in the UFC and showed pretty poor fight IQ. Obviously, hope he's okay. And hopefully we can see Leavitt against a harsher test next time out. So that wrapped up. No, this fight card was a shit show. 3 fights got canceled, like 2 hours out of it. So almost all the fights were main card, including the one I just broke down. The next fight I wanted to talk about was Gabriel Benítez versus Justin Jaynes. Jaynes is a wrestler, primarily, who's got power in his hands. Benítez is a long stay in the UFC, who is a very good striker. And striker versus grappler, I almost always give the edge to the grappler. Just they're normally able to find one takedown, and from there just keep it on the ground and win the rounds like that. But Benítez was great. He took full advantage of the southpaw orthodox position. A lot of circling, mixed up his kicks to the leg, body, head. Great hands, especially an uppercut he kept landing, which I think dissuaded Jaynes from shooting for takedowns. But he kept landing. He landed a lot of hard shots to the head and wasn't putting him away. So he timed a beautiful knee to the solar plexus for a finish. Jorge Masvidal is the best example of a longtime fighter putting something together, figuring something out, and taking his game to the next level. That's the sort of path Benítez wants to take in the UFC at this point. I'm not saying he's the next Jorge Masvidal, but I'm saying when you look at a guy with that many fights in the UFC, lots of wins, lots of losses, and you see something awesome like that knee to the body, that's where my mind jumps. So looking forward to whatever's next for Benítez.
Flying knee KO in his future?
You never know. So then, unfortunately, like I said, 3 fights got scrapped off this card. One of them was one of the ones I'd broken down a week ago, but luckily there were 2 left I did break down. The first of those was the co-main event between Jamal Hill and Owen St. Preux. So I had 3 questions going into the fight. I thought it would be a southpaw versus southpaw matchup. So my first question was Hill's right hand, which looked absolutely beautiful in his last fight. My second question was who's going to get the better of the power kicks in this southpaw versus southpaw matchup, because southpaws typically aren't very good at defending power kicks from other southpaws. And my third question was, what is Hill going to do about St. Preux's grappling? So those questions weren't quite answered to my satisfaction, in the sense that that's not really how the fight played out. The first reason, I think, is St. Preux knew how dangerous Hill's right hand was. So he had a lot of stance switching between southpaw and orthodox. And he kept his distance in a more kickboxing range than boxing range. So that took away from Hill's right hand. When he wasn't southpaw, he got the better of the power kicks. He landed a lot of hard-looking leg kicks, a couple of which took their effect on Hill. But on St. Preux showed, I don't really know what he was doing, because it seems like he was getting the worst of the exchanges when he was in orthodox and the better of the exchanges when he was in southpaw. But he kept going back to orthodox. That power kick was his best shot all night. But he wasn't, I mean, there's a danger of it being checked, but that was his best shot. You've got to, if that's the thing you're landing that's doing the most damage, you've got to keep going back to that. And he didn't. So one round in, Hill was pressuring better. I had it for him. In the second round, Hill kept pressuring, and the defense of St. Preux stopped holding up. Hill started landing harder and harder shots. St. Preux's defense got weaker and weaker. He backed against the cage. A couple more hard shots from Hill, and that was it. The ref had to step in and end it with a TKO because St. Preux was out of there. It was just, he didn't grapple. He didn't use that power kick enough. So Hill got past a veteran gatekeeper. He's absolutely top 15 material. I'm a bit dissatisfied by the game plan St. Preux put in, so I still have plenty of questions about Hill, but great finish by him, great power, great accuracy finding his shots, great patience to go a round and a half against a guy like St. Preux, who, don't get me wrong, is very dangerous, and find that finish. Then the last fight, saved the best for last in this case, was Marvin Vettori versus Jack Hermansson, and it was absolutely the best fight of the night. I said high risk for Hermansson, high opportunity for Vettori, and it's interesting. Vettori was the favorite coming in on short notice as a lower ranked fighter against Hermansson, but hey, people put their money when people put their money down, there's some thinking going behind it, and the betting odds are right more often than not, and that's what happened. So first round striking exchanges, I thought Hermansson was getting a little bit better of it, but Vettori was really pressuring hard. That paid off for him. He landed a nice left hand that dropped Hermansson, looked for a guillotine finish, which was a bit questionable. The ground and pound finish was probably an easier route, but he couldn't find it. Hermansson's a tough SOB, but Vettori definitely took the first round. Second round, Hermansson tried to force a grappling exchange. Like I was talking about previously, when you try and force a grappling exchange against a high-level grappler, that often does not work out well for you. And Vettori showed himself to be a high-level grappler. I wasn't sure going in to this fight if he'd be willing to accept top position against Hermansson, who's very dangerous off his back. And I thought it would show the confidence of Vettori, where his grappling's at, and then the fight IQ, because if he has the high level grappling to do that, it's a great decision. If he does that and gets submitted, it's a horrible decision. It was a great decision for him. He was able to win the second round by just hitting a beautiful switch during Hermansson's takedown attempt, then stayed on top for about 3 minutes. Hermansson had a very active guard. He was constantly trying to move into full guard, constantly trying to look for throwing up a triangle, look for a sweep to get on top, but Vettori read it, stayed on top. He wasn't inactive. I enjoyed the grappling exchange, which I often don't do. Great round by Vettori. Third round's where it got really interesting. Vettori is a big muscular guy, and typically guys like that who put out a high pressure style are going to gas, and that's what you started to see in the third round. He slowed down, Hermansson read it, and really stepped up the pressure. The thing, I'll talk about that later, actually, but Hermansson just pressure. He was throwing a lot of punches, and he took the round off that pressure. Great corner work in Vettori's corner by Rafael Cordero. He told him, hey, you lost that round. You're up 2, but you need to go get this round. And this is where it became a real awesome fight, because Vettori had taken a round off, so his gas got a little higher. So actually taking that third round off turned out to be the right move for him, because he was able to come out and match Hermansson's intensity in the fourth round. And they were both going for it. They were both swinging. They both had crazy chins, and they're both trying to knock each other out. It was still high-level striking, southpaw orthodox, both trying to land their power hand, both trying to set it up with a jab. Lots of pressure. Awesome fourth round, but Vettori just threw more, landed probably similar accuracy, but you throw more, you throw harder, you get the better of the striking exchange. As I said in the breakdown, Hermansson is an amazing grappler who's turned himself into a good striker, and Vettori was just the better striker. Similar story in the fifth round, and Vettori took the fight 4-1. I'm not sure if it was a 10-8. So that puts Vettori in a very interesting position, because I think Jack Hermansson was the 4th ranked fighter going in. And now Marvin Vettori is on a win streak. He has a split decision loss to Israel Adesanya, as I talked about. So he called out Paulo Costa, which is a very brave call out, because Adesanya made Costa look like he didn't know what he was doing, but you've got to think that's going to put a chip on Costa's shoulder, and no one else has been able to do that to him. So that's a high risk and almost low reward fight, because Costa's stock is low now after that Adesanya loss. So he's going to be hungry, have less to lose. He's lost that unbeaten record. So that's an interesting fight. Jared Cannonier would be an interesting fight, but I really want to see him fight Darren Till, so I don't want to see that. Robert Whittaker would be a real interesting fight, because they both have losses to Adesanya. They both want to fight him again, so that's the fight I like most, even though I think Whittaker should have already earned the shot at Adesanya, but we might talk about that in another episode. And yeah, so we'll see what's next for Marvin Vettori. One other thing I'll add to Jack Hermansson is it sounds like he was pretty badly concussed in that first round by the knockdown, so he didn't quite have his wits about him for the next 4 rounds the way you'd hope. So maybe his stock should be higher than it might be. And he also broke a toe, because one of the knocks on him was the way Vettori was circling away. He was always circling to his power side and just making a battle of, I can land my left hand better than you can land your right hand. But when you do that, constantly backing up, it makes the power kick a real good option to throw. And that's what the commentators were calling for, because that was the right thing to do. If the guy's constantly moving back, you throw the head kick there. If the hands are low, which they were, then you have a good chance of landing that. The reason Hermansson wasn't doing that is because he broke his toe. Now, it seems like he might have broken his toe on Vettori's elbow, so credit to Vettori for that. But I just thought I'd throw that in there. And that wraps up UFC Fight Night Vegas 16. It was a fun card of 8 fights. The other Saturday night event to talk about was Errol Spence Jr. versus Danny Garcia. I didn't watch any of the other fights on the card, but I did watch the main event, hoping for a super fight to materialize out of this. And I think it did. I'd never seen Errol Spence Jr. box before, but everything he does is what I love about boxing. Just throws volume, throws accuracy, sets up his shots. He had a beautiful jab, landed it to the body, landed it to the head. I don't know enough about boxing to say all the amazing things he did, but I know it was amazing. And now I really, really, really want to see Errol Spence Jr. versus Terrence Bud Crawford. That is the number one fight to make in boxing right now. Errol Spence Jr., I think, had a lot on his mind going into this fight post-car crash. So after winning it, he seemed happy to just savor the moment, not call out and try and make a super fight. He said he wants to fight in the summer. So in boxing, there's 4 major titles. Spence holds 2. Crawford holds 1. So I'd actually love to see Crawford fight Manny Pacquiao next, who holds the other one at that weight class, because Terrence deserves a super fight. He hasn't gotten to fight the caliber of opponents that Spence Jr. has, just due to what broadcasters they're signed with. So those same broadcasting difficulties would materialize with Crawford Pacquiao as they would with Crawford Spence Jr. But if that's going to happen now, they have to navigate that anyway. So it would hype Spence Jr. more versus Crawford, and it would be a super fight that I think Crawford's earned. So as a boxing fan, I'd hope to see that. Then last thing in the combat corner is the preview for this coming UFC 256. Before I preview the card, there's 2 things I have to talk about because I'm going to be circling back to them a lot throughout the preview. The first is COVID. The UFC has been having a lot of fights get canceled, some of them very last minute. So before I preview this card, I'm going to do a live check to see if in the last hour or 2 hours anything has changed, because honestly, that's the state of all sports right now, but especially the UFC. I really don't know if the card I'm previewing is actually what it's going to look like come Saturday night. So disclaimer that this is being recorded at Monday, 11:15 a.m., December 7th. The second thing I'm going to circle back to a lot is the UFC is making a 60-man roster cut sometime in the next month, 2 months. We've talked a fair bit on this podcast, and we'll continue to talk about the financial ramifications of COVID and what that means for the leagues, the schedules, the competition, and the athletes, and we will continue to do so. The UFC, it's particularly frustrating to talk about because all those other leagues have unions and 50-50 revenue splits. In the UFC, it's more like 20 for the athletes and 80 for the organizations. So I understand that COVID has taken its economic toll on the UFC, and the UFC are obligated to make hard financial decisions because of that. But I still really don't like the decisions they're making, and we're going to talk about that a bunch. So they cut Yoel Romero in the past week as an example of that, because he is 1-5 in his last 5. But those losses are to Robert Whittaker, Israel Adesanya, and Paulo Costa. Those are 3 of the top 4 middleweights in the world right now. So if you're not cutting Yoel Romero because he's lost 4 of his last 5, you're cutting him because you have to pay him 6 digits every time he walks in the octagon. And we've talked about the Contender Series a bunch, and that seems to be how the UFC is going to supplement the cuts they're making. They're bringing in all these guys who they can give $12K to show, $12K to win contracts, so they can have 10 fighters for the price of 1 longtime fighter. So I'm going to have to keep circling back to that when I talk about these fights. Now, before I do so, I'm going to do a quick check to make sure nothing's been canceled. All right. No fights have been canceled since I last checked. The last canceled fight being Carl Roberson versus Dalka Lungiambula, which happened sometime this morning. So we're going to go through this card top to bottom, starting at the main event, Devson Figueiredo versus Brandon Moreno. And those are very fresh names in our mind, as they were the fighters on the first podcast we talked about at UFC 255. Figueiredo is on track to revitalize the flyweight division. 1 year ago, the UFC was talking about canceling it. They were cutting fighters. They were ready to get rid of it. And Figueiredo might have single-handedly turned this around by when we get to the end of December, I'm going to talk about my fighters, fights, events of the year. But spoiler alert, Devson Figueiredo is almost certainly going to be fighter of the year for me. And he has an opportunity to cement that this coming Saturday. The man missed weight, showed up against Joseph Benavidez in a fight where he couldn't win the title, got technically outstruck for a good portion of that fight, but found his power shots and brutally finished Benavidez, giving himself the opportunity to do so again, which then he stepped into the octagon come June, July, and finished him even quicker and even more brutally. What do you do after two fairly quick finishes in title fights? You put on an even quicker finish in your next title fight against a guy who's on an absolute tear. Now, we talked about that and had some questions about the fence grabbing, which I did not like. So that's certainly on my mind. But we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt for now and assume it was an honest mistake and that he's not going to do so in this next match against Moreno. Moreno is the true number one contender. Let's be honest. It was a snub that he didn't get the shot against Figueiredo last month. He should have. The fact that the opponent he was fighting when he was ranked higher did really, I don't know what the matchmaking decision was there, but he did a very commendable thing in stepping forward anyway, putting on his best performance, getting a finish, looking great, and now he has an opportunity to make that wrong right. So stylistically, both guys have good stand-up. Both guys have great grappling. At flyweight, it's really fun because the dynamic transitions between the two are very fast and let the athletes show off how much speed and power they have in their legs as well as their arms. So I'll be looking for all that. That's always fun. But what I'm really curious about is to see if Moreno can stretch Figueiredo out. He's a very strong fighter. I think he walks around at 150 something pounds, which is what I walk around at. And I've got about 10 inches on him. So that's what I'm looking for from Moreno. He has the footwork to do so, to circle away from the power, crazy looping shots Figueiredo is going to be throwing at him. He has the grappling to not let Figueiredo get that crazy tight guillotine squeeze he showed last week. Let's see if he has the patience to do all those things and extend him over 5 rounds, and especially see what Figueiredo looks like in the 4th and 5th round, because in the 1st and 2nd round, he is a terrifying savage who seems nigh unstoppable. Now, to be honest, I'm more excited about this co-main event than the main event, Tony Ferguson versus Charles Oliveira, and that's because it's in what for me is the UFC's premier division, men's lightweight. So I'm going to return to this theme a couple times throughout the card, but this is a crossroads fight. This is the old and successful versus the new and upcoming in many ways. Tony Ferguson put on what might be the best streak the men's lightweight division has ever seen. It was 12 fights, and 1 year ago we were talking about Tony Ferguson as the boogeyman, the unstoppable force who everyone wanted to see in a super fight against Khabib, who didn't seem possible to beat on the feet and had the beautiful grappling to make it always dangerous when it's on the ground. And there seemed to be no clear way to stop him other than just hold him down for 5 rounds. Justin Gaethje showed us that wasn't true last April, stepping in on short notice and putting an absolute technical beating on Ferguson, showing great head movement, hard 2-3 punch combos consistently over 25 minutes, mixed in with beautiful leg kicks. There's now a formula to beat Tony Ferguson. And in revisionist history, you look at the last 2 years of Tony Ferguson's career, and he's fought Donald Cowboy Cerrone and Anthony Pettis. Those are not top 5 lightweight names. So the question circulating now is, how good is Tony Ferguson actually at this point in his career? Is he still the boogeyman I thought he was 1 year ago? Now, Charles Oliveira has had a very interesting career where he's been in the UFC a long time, but every time he stepped up against top-level competition, he fell short. He fell short against Max Holloway. He fell short against Jim Miller. He fell short against Anthony Pettis. He fell short against Paul Felder. And in between all those fights, he looked great. But when they put him against new guys without a ton of experience, guys who weren't top 10, top 15 fighters, he looked awesome. Crazy jiu-jitsu. But every time he'd get back in there against the top dog and fall short. So same story running after his most recent loss against Paul Felder 3 years ago. Puts together some nice wins against smaller names. Crazy finishing streak. He now holds the record for most submissions in UFC history, and he was starting to mix in some nice stand-up there. I believe against Jared Gordon, he actually had a finish on the feet. So he was starting to show great stand-up, and the same questions start to emerge. Okay, when he has enough wins in a row to get a top-level guy, what's he going to look like this time? He got that opportunity last March against Kevin Lee, an excellent wrestler who has cardio issues, but also real knockout power on the feet. And Oliveira came in and looked great. He looked great on the feet. He didn't get smashed on the ground. He managed to bring Kevin Lee into the later rounds. And then the third round, timed a perfect guillotine and finished it from half guard, which is crazy impressive against Lee. He finally got a win over that top dog. Now he has an even steeper opportunity in front of him in Tony Ferguson. So in terms of the style, both guys are really, really high-level jiu-jitsu guys. I really hope this goes to the ground at some point because I want to see what the scrambling looks like and who gets the better of it. Tony Ferguson, the submission that stands out to me the most is the Darce choke he had against Edson Barboza. He also had, again, a great triangle against the aforementioned Kevin Lee. Charles Oliveira, guillotines, anacondas. If it's on the ground, he can find a way. So who's going to triumph there is a really interesting question, but every fight starts on the feet. I give the edge to Tony Ferguson on the feet just because he's been in there against higher level guys. Anthony Pettis looked good. In Cowboy Cerrone looked good. He did hurt Gaethje at the end of the second round. He is a great fighter on the feet. His spinning elbows, all his weirdness is really fun to watch on the feet. But Oliveira's turned himself into an excellent technical striker. The UFC men's lightweight division is wide open right now, and whoever wins this fight should get a title shot, in my opinion. So this is absolutely the most interesting fight on the card for me, and I cannot wait. If you can take away the whole card, MMA gods, please don't take away this fight. But also please don't take away the whole card because the rest of it's pretty interesting too. Next one, Renato Moicano versus Rafael Fiziev. I'm going to go through this quick. Moicano was a great featherweight, fell a little short against Aldo, has moved up to men's lightweight, looked great, but a lot of question marks still. Rafael just put on an absolute striking clinic against Mark Diakiese, a great striker. He showed beautiful head movement to dodge all the head kicks Diakiese threw at him. He threw crazy body kicks. The men's lightweight division, I said, is the premier UFC division for a reason. Neither of these guys have a number next to their name, and honestly, they're both still probably a couple wins away, but this is going to be an awesome fight. Next up, we got another crossroads fight. Jacare Souza versus Kevin Holland. Jacare is a longtime UFC fighter, gets a lot of money every time he steps into the cage relative to what these new guys are getting, and does not have a winning record in his last 5. Now, his losses are to top guys. His most recent loss was a real stinger, but it was against Jan Blachowicz, who is now the light heavyweight champion. So you can't knock a middleweight for moving up to light heavyweight and then losing against a guy who it turns out is number 1 in the division. He has a loss to Kelvin Gastelum, which was a split decision and very close. And he has wins over Chris Weidman and Derek Brunson, who are great middleweights, but not top 5 middleweights. So if I'm Jacare, I'm nervous because everything in his profile suggests he's the type of fighter the UFC is looking to cut. Gets a lot of money, Not a great past 5 record if you just look at wins and losses and don't consider who those wins and losses are to and the context of the actual fights. Kevin Holland has been a very active fighter. This will be his 4th fight in 2020, and he had 4 fights in 2019. He's shown some weaknesses. He's shown some strength. He's shown a lot of improvement over that time. He's a very game guy, and he's got a tough challenge in Jacare Souza. Jacare had a crazy fight of the year against Chris Weidman a year and a bit ago, which he was losing and then managed to win with awesome hands. So he has those hands. He has phenomenal grappling. So we'll see where Kevin Holland is at with that one. This next one might be the one I'm second most excited for in Ciryl Gane versus Junior Dos Santos. Dos Santos, another crossroads fighter. Not a great past few fights if you just look at his record, and gets paid a lot to step in the cage. I just watched one of Cyril's most recent fights against Tanner Boser, and he looked so phenomenal, especially because he's a heavyweight. He looked like a mixed martial artist, which you don't often see at heavyweight. He was switching stances, he was throwing hooks, he was throwing uppercuts, he was using a beautiful left and right-handed jab, lots of body front kicks. He'd bring it to a grappling clinch exchange, look for a takedown. It wasn't there. Okay, he's switching to a knee. This guy looks like he could be a top 5 heavyweight fighter right now. And he has that opportunity to show us what he can do against Junior Dos Santos, who was once at the top, but seems to be declining. He did not look at the peak he used to in his 2 most recent losses to Jairzinho Rosenstrike and Curtis Blades, who are in fact top 5 heavyweights. So that's the opportunity Ciryl has in front of him, to look as good as those two did and throw his name in there, because it's a thin division at the top of heavyweight, and you put together an impressive win over a top 15 guy, you're looking at main event opportunities. So Ciryl, I just talked about striking. His 2 finishes in the UFC are by submission. One of them is by heel hook. I'm super pumped for this main card opener. All right, we're running pretty long in the combat corner, so I'm going to cut the prelim analysis short and stick to 2 fights. The first one, we're going to keep our top to bottom format going. So Mackenzie Dern versus Virna Jandiroba. This is going to be a women's strawweight match between 2 Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belts, which I hope that's exactly what we see, an MMA fight between 2 black belts that happens mostly on the ground. Now, Dern is younger, and she's working on her stand-up, so she might think she has a striking advantage, and she might try and win the fight through that. But I'm just really hoping this goes to the ground, because I want to see some awesome transitions. Women's grappling is always extra fun because of the added flexibility they have. Both women have, I think all their wins have been submission finishes thus far in the UFC. I hope one of them finds that. The winner of this fight is got to get some top contender opportunities moving forward, because you look at their past winning record, that's where they're at. So I hope to see a really fun grappling match and a contender emerge who can start trying to march their way to the top, because 5 to 15 in women's strawweight is a little stale and bottlenecked at the moment. Other fight I'm going to break down a little more because we love our CanCon is Gavin Governor Tucker versus Billy Quarantillo. So Gavin Tucker is he seems to me to be who we thought of UFC fighters as when we were growing up and first came across the UFC. He's covered in like that neo-trad tattoo work. He can use his striking. He can use his grappling. He's not a first-generation MMA fighter. He's a second-generation hybrid MMA fighter who seems to have trained the disciplines separately, as opposed to the third-generation MMA fighters we're seeing now who trains all the disciplines together, like I was describing about Ciryl Gane. He's going up against Billy Quarantillo, who is one of the success stories of the Dana White Contender Series so far. He's coming off, I believe he's on a 3-fight win streak in the UFC. He's looked great in all of them, 2 finishes and a fight of the night, an amazing fight against Spike Carlisle, which I've talked about in a previous podcast. Gavin really impressed me in his last fight. He took a bad punch in the striking exchange in the first round, lost it because he got dropped, and then got mounted for a guillotine, which looked dangerous. And in the last 30, 40 seconds of that round, managed to reverse it and get an arm triangle position and end the round dominantly, even though he lost it. And then the second round, he came out and just something clicked for him, and he started mixing up the striking beautifully. I think his opponent gassed, but he stayed loose, he stayed technical, he stayed pressuring, and he had a dominant, beautiful striking second round. Third round started on the exact same trajectory, and the striking got so dominant, his opponent had to look for a bad shot, and he found a rear naked choke pretty easily from the grappling position he was able to get off that bad shot. So for this fight, I'm looking for Gavin Tucker to do the same. He finds a way to win even when things aren't going his way, make the right reads, make the veteran moves. Billy Quarantillo is a great grappler who's a good striker. So I really like Tucker's adaptability as someone who finds his opponent's weakest point and where he's strongest and manages to make the fight happen there. But if a grappling opportunity presents itself, he can take it and be secure in it. Our boy takes this and, hey, 32 years old, 34 maybe, I can't quite remember, but maybe he has an opportunity for one push at the top of the featherweight division. Either way, it should be an awesome fight, and I've certainly got my eye on it. And that's where I'm going to cut the preview of this card off because this has rambled too long already.